Hello and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we're talking the 1947 Best Actress race at the Academy Awards, where Loretta Young won for her performance in The Farmer's Daughter. But why did she beat fellow nominees Joan Crawford, Susan Hayward, Dorothy McGuire, and Rosalind Russell? We'll explore all this and more today on And the Runner-Up Is. Hello and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I'm your host, Kevin Jacobson, here to talk about the 20th year of Best Actress at the Oscars, which covered the films of 1947. We'll be discussing why Loretta Young won, why the losers lost, and who we think was the runner-up of this Best Actress race. And my guest today has been heard 3 times on the Best Picture series, talking about years in the 30s, the 50s, and the 80s. Here he is for a new decade, talking the 40s. Owner of the Film Experience. Please welcome back to the show, Nathaniel Rogers. Welcome back.
Yay, I'm excited to be here and to cover each and every decade. I love all eras of movies, so it's very exciting.
Yes, you're very versed in that way.
Yes, true.
Alrighty, well, before we talk 1947, let's talk about just Best Actress as a category, something I'm sure that you have feelings on. My first question for you is, what is your favorite Best Actress win of all time?
Well, I was going to say Judy Garland and A Star is Born, but then she didn't win.
Maybe we'll wait for the other question on that one. Yeah.
No, my favorite... this is before my time, but in just terms of the one I think about the most is Jane Fonda and Clute.
Nice.
The whole performance, I find just like the perfect example of what I really love about actors when they get fearless and they're just performing. They're not registering what the audience reaction might be. They're just inside of it.
Right.
And I totally feel that with her performance, which is why one of my favorite beats in any performance ever is when she looks at her watch while fucking, because she's a prostitute. Because it's this moment where you realize she's not inside of the moment. She's actually detached from it. And I just love everything about that performance.
Yes, that's a really, really excellent win. I'm very excited to eventually get to Jane, and that whole era for her really is very exciting. So, excellent. My other question on the flip side, I guess you could say Judy, unless you have another one. What would you say is your most heartbreaking loss in Best Actress?
Yeah, I want to do something in my lifetime for the heartbreaking loss.
There we go.
So that would be Michelle Pfeiffer and Fabulous Baker Boys.
Yes. To
me, which is the quintessential luminous star turn, that it's like the peak of somebody's beauty, the peak of their ability, the peak of their fame. It's like, that's when you give them the Oscar.
Right. That is very true. Not a Jessica Tandy fan, I take it.
I mean, she's fine in the movie, but Michelle Pfeiffer was doing, like, and plus the movie's so great.
Yeah.
Fabulous Baker.
Agree. That would definitely have been the time to do it for Michelle. So that is definitely heartbreaking, and that's the first time someone has said that so far. So I love when I get a new answer there. So excellent. Alrighty, well, let's jump into 1947, the 20th Academy Awards. The nominees were Joan Crawford for Possessed, Susan Hayward for Smash Up, The Story of a Woman, Dorothy McGuire for Gentleman's Agreement, Rosalind Russell for Mourning Becomes Electra, and Loretta Young for The Farmer's Daughter, with the winner being Loretta Young. So, Nathaniel, before we break down these performances just on an individual level, do you have any overall thoughts on this lineup and watching or rewatching them again for this?
I mean, my overall feeling is that it's kind of like a middling category. It has a little of everything, a little of like greatness and a little of, this is fine, and a little of lazy voting. So it's like the full spectrum.
Yeah, that's very true. I think it's an interesting lineup for sure. I feel like when I look at this lineup, there's no one performance that I feel like has really stood the test of time in a significant way. You know, certainly for fans of Joan Crawford, I think Possessed is one of the favorites, so I could see that. But I guess you don't see a lot of support nowadays for people like, you know, Dorothy McGuire or even the winner, Loretta Young, in these performances. I mean, Susan Hayward maybe a little bit, but I don't know if it's like a towering performance. I mean, obviously, the big headline here is the Rosalind Russell of it all, with
Yes.
everyone expecting her to win for this big theatrical performance. But I don't know if it's necessarily held up as a huge, like, she was robbed moment that people are hanging on to, like the Judy Garland for Star is Born, for example.
Right. Yeah.
But I do like the fact that I'll say this. I think most of the women here are playing very complex characters. You know, they're not saintly. Uh, Other than the winner, I guess you could say, is sort of in that vein. But these are some pretty juicy characters, and we're definitely seeing this gradual shift to more complicated roles in this category, which I personally do appreciate, and going to some more raw places. So,
Yeah, I mean, four of the five have really unlikable things about
yeah,
the characterizations,
exactly.
which, as I was just saying about Jane Fonda and Clue, I love that when an actor can go there.
Exactly. Yeah, so I'm excited to just hear our thoughts on all those complicated characters. Shall we jump in?
Sure.
Alrighty, let's go in alphabetical order with these losing nominees, starting with a big one here, Joan Crawford for Possessed. So, Joan Crawford is now in this exciting new phase of her career, post Mildred Pierce, post Oscar win, where she's getting offered some really great parts. She made Humoresque after Mildred Pierce, and then right after that, we have Possessed here. Not to be confused with another film called Possessed that Joan had done back in the 30s.
Hmm.
But for this one, she really prepared for it extensively because it's about a woman who is gradually going mad to the point of psychosis. So she went to mental hospitals and talked to psychiatrists and just really intently went through the script because she just wanted to get it right. She wanted to be authentic and to really ground this character in a way. So the film is about her character Louise, who works as a nurse for a married woman who is ill, and she works there in this rich household, and she is also just madly in love with the family's neighbor, but he doesn't quite reciprocate her feelings, and she's just desperate for him to love her, but it just never really happens, and she's literally driven mad by it. And also, we have this framing device where we're introduced to her in the beginning, just wandering the streets, muttering David to herself, who that's the neighbor's name. And she's checked into a psych ward where they're trying to figure out her story. And so the story is told through flashback, actually, very similar to Mildred Pierce. So let's talk Joan. I'm sure you have some kind of take on Joan Crawford overall. So I'm curious what you think of Joan and what you think of her in this film.
I mean, I live for I live.
I
It's
figured.
a very gay response, but
Yeah.
listen, Joan
Yeah.
Crawford, diva, and
Mm-hmm.
such a great actor. And I one thing I love about her is that, like, I think for modern sensibilities, like, people think that she's a little wooden. Like, her performances
Mm.
can feel a little stiff if you compare them to modern performances.
Yeah.
But what I love about that is the mask like face she always wears near the beginning of the movie.
Yeah.
You can see it breaking down. Like, she's very good at, like, anguish and things that, like, sort of mess up this, like, frozen exterior.
Mm.
And so, like, I love, it's so camp in a way, but I love that the first real shot of her once the story gets going is when her hospital bed, they roll it up, and so she's sort of lifting into the camera.
Yeah.
And it's very like Bride of Frankenstein, like she's alive.
Yeah.
And I just love it. And then you watch the whole story unfold on her face. I mean, I realize that it's very stylized acting, but I think she's great.
Yeah. Well, we're definitely starting strong here for me because I love this performance. And yes, it's a lot, and it can really it's kind of indulging in the melodrama of it all. Maybe it's not the most sensitive in dealing with mental illness. I'm not sure, but I honestly had a lot of fun watching this. I don't necessarily consider it to be high art, which is
Right.
actually why I'm glad that she's nominated here anyway, because, she is by far the best part of this film. She is truly carrying this movie on her shoulders.
On her shoulder pads.
Right. Which, again, I'm sure were very well padded shoulders indeed.
Yes.
So I will just say that I feel like Joan has an unfair advantage as an actress where I feel like she was just blessed with a face that is so expressive and so well suited for these darker psychological films. And that is very evident just in those first 15 or so minutes of the film where she's just walking around in this state and she seems confused and she's lost, almost like she has amnesia. And she's looking around for David and she's brought into the hospital. And I feel like she's so good at playing that version of the character when that very easily could have been kind of laughable, I guess, in another actor's hands. But even from the prologue, I had like an emotional reaction and like an investment in this character, especially when the doctors are trying to make her tell them her story and she's like physically is straining because she can't find the words. She just physically can't do it. And there's also such a great sense of tone in this opening that is really layered in that kind of horror feeling. And
Yeah.
the fact that she's so still and she doesn't know how to speak, it's kind of unnerving,
Yeah, and I also think it's like really, I mean, it's not her best movie of the 40s in any
No.
sense, but it is an interesting movie in terms of like you can see the seeds of the next phase of her career in it, whereas you don't really see that in Mildred Pierce. Mildred Pierce is like, this peak where it's opening up, as you said, it's opening up these new opportunities for her, and she's suddenly a huge star again after some rough few years. But with this one, you can totally see Baby Jane coming,
Oh yeah.
And Straight Jacket and all that stuff,
The hacksploitation.
Yeah.
Yes. So going into the flashback, we have right away this just very clear indication that she is just head over heels in love with David, and he's like playing the piano and she's just enraptured by him. And I think it's the kind of thing like Leave Her to Heaven, actually, where she's really into this guy, but then that passion is something that turns into obsession. Like she's a little too into him and she's talking about how she wants a monopoly on him. But he just does not care. All he cares about is math.
You might say that she's possessed.
There you have it, folks. Yes. He's very like logical and very math science based, and he just doesn't have time to get into a romance, And I think he says like he doesn't want to be smothered, but there's such a desperation in her voice that it almost makes you pity this character for just being so in love with this guy who really does not care about her like at all,
Right.
Never will. And I do think there are a handful of elements that this movie does share with Mildred Pierce, where she's just really desperate for the approval of another person. Like in that case, it was her daughter. And here it's this romantic partner, and she doesn't realize that like her desperation almost becomes like a repellent to the other person, and no matter what she does, she's not going to make it better.
And she, like, the interesting thing about that is she recognizes that from the beginning in a way.
Hmm.
So it's sort of like she's self-aware at the beginning, and then she sort of loses her. It's like she sees all the red flags and then just dives in anyways.
Yeah.
Because in that first scene, she says, "I have no shame,"
Right.
And I'm embarrassing myself, and all these things that she's totally aware of, and then they just begin to erode her sort of sanity.
Right. And she is kind of just pushing ahead anyway, because she wants David more than anything else, even if she realizes she's being ridiculous. But yeah, it's just that sort of like eager for approval quality that she has. And if I were to project onto Joan herself, like maybe that there's a part of her as an actress and wanting to be taken seriously and to get these good parts, that she's almost able to translate that into these characters who are also very eager in that respect.
Well, I mean, that is an interesting thing about her work, though, because like
Mm,
these characters are so like desperate for approval, and
mm,
yet she was such like a self-possessed star. And at the same time, she was a star who was very, very concerned with what people thought of her,
right.
like very like in terms of fandom and all that, you know.
Hmm. Yeah,
So it's a you could it you know it's almost like it invites you to she invites you to project onto it
that's true.
almost.
Yeah. And so we get this big catalyst point that really sets off this character into just like a tailspin where the woman that she's taken care of, Mrs. Graham, she thinks that that Louise is having an affair with her husband, so there's some weird resentment there, and eventually Mrs. Graham winds up dead in the lake, and it's found to be a suicide, but Louise really just is blaming herself, and you see just all the guilt all over her face. And I would say it maybe even makes you wonder in the audience if Louise did have something to do with it. And to the film's credit, I do think that it does a pretty good job of making you as uncertain about it as she is, kind of like an unreliable narrator sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, and there's stuff later in the movie too that does that where, when she starts losing track of what's real and what she's imagined, like you're also it's so like melodramatic,
Hmm.
it's easy to buy into the fact that these like fantasies she's having are also really happening. Like
Yeah,
the first time I saw it, I totally believed the first like really real break from reality. I totally believed and
yeah,
bought that it was happening.
same. Yeah. So again, a credit to the film for that sort of the editing choices there. But one of my favorite elements of the film is just her interactions with Mrs. Graham's daughter, Carol,
Hmm.
and she comes around and she also thinks that Louise was having an affair with her father, which Louise is just all the more terrified, and I think it speaks to also just Joan's ability as kind of a scream queen too, where it's like leading
Hmm.
up to those moments she's hearing noises in the house and she doesn't know what's going on, and the way she's just like widening her eyes, especially when she's terrified, is it's very affecting, I would say.
That girl Geraldine Brooks, who plays her stepdaughter or something, um, I thought she was really good in it. And at
Yeah,
first, I was like, "Oh, is this a Vita Mildred Pierce thing?" But
yeah,
the character's very different.
right. She does play well off of younger girls for whatever reason. But so we have some time passing, and we have David, who's been away for a while, coming back into the picture where he's taken on a job with Mr. Graham, and she's still working at this household. And I love the way that she plays that scene where she's so excited but also so stressed out, and she's like trying to pour these drinks for them, and she had no idea that any of this was coming. And I think maybe in some regard that she may have even moved on, but then him being back in the picture is really bringing back all these memories and all that obsession. And it's just very sad, like whenever they're together alone and she is like begging him to kiss her. and
Yeah.
and she even says like, even if you don't mean it, like you can still kiss me anyway. I'm just like, oh girl.
I want to say through all five of these movies, I was saying, "Oh, girl," so many times.
It's truly. Ugh, and it just gets worse from there, truly.
It's not a feminist picture, Possessed.
Probably not, no, but fun to watch. Um,
Yes.
but I mean, after that, we have Mr. Graham actually becoming quite fond of her, and he's asking her to marry him. And I love that her reaction is just like she bursts out laughing. Um,
Yeah.
but then you see her sort of making the mental calculations in her mind that like maybe I could lead the kind of life that I want and be kind of a higher class. And I think also part of it is just her pride of being rejected by David once again. I think she has some nuance in those particular scenes.
She really gets to run the full gamut in this movie.
Yeah. It truly gives her everything to do, every emotion. um, and I would love to talk about that scene at the party where David is there and he's flirting with Carol, and Louise sees this, and the way she just tells David, like, stay away from Carol in this ice cold way, she's the master at that.
Yeah.
And then we really start to see like the downturn in her mental health when she's at the concert and the piano player is starting to play the song that David had always played on the piano, and she's getting very emotional and runs home, and that's where we have this big hallucination of confronting Carol and slapping her around, even when that turns out to be in her own mind. But I love that reveal because it did fake me out, especially in this movie where it feels like anything can happen, like nothing is too melodramatic. Could easily take that at face value.
Yeah, and because it's shot in such a way of like this sort of like noir, and the shadows and the rain and all this stuff, it feels so heightened that you totally believe everything.
Right. And so I mean, things just keep going downhill, and I have to say, I think she really is tracking that journey for her character very well, of just that mental breakdown and how she's now convinced herself that she had something to do with the suicide, and that now Mrs. Graham has come back and she's haunting her. It's just that terror that really this blend of being affected on a human level, but also in the way that horror movies can be kind of entertaining. It's like you sort of just can't look away by the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that Mrs. Graham is not in the movie.
Right. Yeah.
We never see her, and I mean, it's a very Rebecca, sort of pattern of, it's very gothic, like a haunting without an actual ghost.
Exactly. Which makes it more spooky, I would say. So, I mean, by the end, she's just barely even containing her anger and her contempt for Carol when she says that she might marry David, and she's somehow convinced that he's just doing this to be close to her. And it's clear by now that she's just completely lost the plot. She's lost in her own mind, and some drastic action is taken. Don't want to spoil it too much, but yeah, I mean, I think overall this is a fantastic nomination for her that really encapsulates a lot of what I love in a Joan Crawford performance. Just like full commitment to the point where sometimes, yes, it can verge into camp, but I think she does straddle the line pretty well, and I think it is just like a great movie star performance, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, really, all three of her nominations are pretty great.
Yeah, exactly. They all speak to her strong suits. So, did you have any other details on Joan?
I just wanted to, just remark on her gestural qualities, which are so pronounced and fun, like the way she puts her hand on her forehead or tears at her hair. I mean, it's a very big performance.
Yeah, she's really going for it. Yeah.
Yeah. But I like that.
Me too. Yeah. And she does make it feel like maybe you could be laughing in certain scenes here, but I don't think you're really laughing at her per se. It's more just like the drama of the situation.
Yeah, it's like the extremities, and she does a good job of tracking how big. I mean, it gets very gestural with like the pulling of her hair and all that stuff, but that's also, as you're saying, she is tracking the journey. It's as she loses it where it gets bigger and bigger.
Yeah. So she really devoted herself to this role, and I was actually reading that a woman sued her because they claimed that she copied her and her story basically, and just like copied all her gestures and everything. So she truly was that convincing. So I love that. And just to read one review from Variety at the time, they said that Joan Crawford cops all Thesping honors in this production with a virtuoso performance as a frustrated woman ridden into madness by a guilt-obsessed mind. So the reviews were on her side. People were very kind about this performance. So this is a great follow-up to a winning performance. We haven't really had that very much in the 40s, to be honest, where we have someone winning and then the follow-up is like, this feels like just because you're in the club, we want to give you another nomination. This feels genuine and earned, I would say.
Yeah. A good Afterglow nomination because actually deserved.
Exactly. So let's move on to our next somewhat similar nominee, Susan Hayward, for Smash Up, The Story of a Woman. What do you think of that title, by the way?
I could not love it more.
This is truly the story of a woman.
Right. And about the titles of Susan Hayward movies,
Oh my God.
No actress has as many good film titles as she does. I'm not talking about the quality of the films themselves. I'm talking about the titles.
Yes.
Not just the titles, but the taglines. They are always, always excellent.
Yes. Speaking of high drama, truly.
My favorite of all time for Susan is I'll Cry Tomorrow, with the best tagline of all time. It says, filmed on location inside a woman's soul.
Wow. So powerful.
This one doesn't have as exciting of a tagline, but they all have great taglines and hilarious titles.
Yes. And it culminates with, I want to live! Exclamation point.
Right.
Which is her big win. So there you go. Excited for that one. But yes, we have our first of 3 new people that I get to talk about today. And Susan Hayward, definitely someone who would stick around for a while at the Oscars. She had 5 nominations. Like I said, she won for I Want to Live, which we'll talk about in the 50s. So for some background on Susan, since I haven't talked about her yet, she was a model before she tried acting, and she came to Hollywood to apparently audition for Gone with the Wind, but ultimately she was put in a lot of these smaller parts, eventually making her way up to the more substantial roles, things like I Married a Witch. But then it was in the mid to late 40s that she would start to get these really interesting plum roles like this one. And this film, I guess it's rumored to be based on the relationship between Bing Crosby and Dixie Lee.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it has some elements of A Star is Born that are kind of recognizable here, except with this one we have the genders reversed of the male lead becoming a star and the female lead having already been a star and then descending into alcoholism. That's more or less the story. She's playing Angie Evans, who is a nightclub singer, and she married this guy Ken, played by Lee Bowman, who becomes a matinee idol, and they have a daughter together, and Angie decides to stay home and more or less give up her career while he's away becoming a star. And what ultimately happens is that she turns to alcohol and she spirals into addiction to drinking. So there you go. The story of a woman. So let's talk Susan. What are your thoughts on her as an actress, and what do you think of this, her first nominated performance?
Well, I mean, it's definitely like ringing. It definitely has all the bells and whistles of the type of performance that gets nominated. I think if one movie I would recommend to people with Susan Hayward before this is Adam Had Four Sons with Ingrid Bergman.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, you can totally see she wasn't getting lead roles yet, but you can totally see why she got lead roles shortly afterwards, because she goes toe to toe with Ingrid Bergman and totally does not get blown off the screen. And she was also playing an alcoholic in that. So she was very good at, this, who knows about range, because she often played singers and she often played alcoholics, but she's very good in that narrow singing alcoholics lane.
Fun new typecast to talk about for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I thought she was really good in this. I much better in the back half than in the beginning. I didn't. Whereas with Joan, she starts off strong and gets stronger. With Susan, it takes a while for you to see any point of view. Like, she's just kind of playing this woman. You're like, what are you thinking?
Mm-hmm.
But once she gets to play, the spiraling drunk, she's very good.
Yeah. So for me, I actually don't have a whole lot of experience with Susan Hayward. I haven't really watched a lot of her movies. In fact, the only other one of her nominations that I had seen before this is I Want to Live. exclamation point, um, her winning performance. So I remembered how strong of a presence she was in that, and certainly gives a very committed performance here too. And
Hmm.
I have to admit that I do find it refreshing, especially after going through a lot of the performances in this era of people like Greer Garson and Jennifer Jones and Teresa Wright, who are perfectly fine in their own ways, but I just personally don't have that much passion for them. They don't really make me feel like, they're giving it their all, I guess. Whereas with people like Susan Hayward, yes, some could say that she could get a little hammy maybe and over the top, but I do just respond to this more go for broke style in this era. And I do think that she is part of a changing tide in just the kinds of performances that are rewarded and the films that are being made, which we're slowly coming out of the wartime era, and we're getting these more interesting psychological like character studies.
Hmm.
Um, so I like that. And I think she really fits well in this era also with like film noir starting to become more popular. But for this one, like, I don't know about you, but I don't think that's a great movie necessarily. Like, there's not much subtlety at all in the story. For the first, like you're kind of saying, I don't know, like 30, 40 minutes or so, she's not really doing a whole lot,
Hmm.
where it's just her being very devoted to her husband and she's pushing him to try new things in his career and he's becoming a success and she's happy. It's all this sort of domestic bliss stuff. And I feel
Yeah,
like it takes
it's
a
like,
while.
where is the conflict?
Right.
Where's the conflict for the first half hour? It's
Yeah.
like, what is this be about? Yeah.
Yeah, it takes like a long time for things to really click into place of what this character is going to do and like what even her personality is.
Yeah.
So, yeah, not a whole lot of variety in these first few scenes there, but although I do think it's interesting the way that the alcoholism is brought up and how it starts, where I think it's like she's invited to a party with her husband and she doesn't know a lot of people there, and so she's trying to calm her nerves, and so she has these two drinks, and she
Hmm.
says that she used to do this before like a gig when she was a singer, and it's kind of like casual, kind of tossed off like this was just her routine. But I think it's clear over time that this is the start of this kind of slippery slope. Like, it wasn't some big incident or like an argument between the two
Right.
of them. It was just she wanted to calm her nerves before this party. So I think that's actually something that's realistic from this very over the top film. But
Hmm.
yeah, I guess I'm curious also from you, like, just with the first part of the film, I think a lot of it sort of hinges on the chemistry between her and her co-star. Did you really feel that relationship from the two of them?
No.
Yeah, I didn't either.
No. I mean, I think the other relationships in the movie are so much more interesting than the
Yeah.
central couple. Like her, sort of pseudo friendship with her husband's business partner and her rivalry with her husband's secretary. Those are
Yeah.
like much more interesting relationships. And the actors, and not only that, but the actors seem to be into performing those relationships.
Right.
But yeah, the husband stuff doesn't work, which is why the first half hour is really hard to get through. After that, it's easy movie to watch, very watchable, very involving.
Yeah.
But that first half hour is kind of deadly. And also, it feels like she's not inspired in the first half hour. Like, it doesn't feel like she has a point of view on the character. It's almost like, oh, she wanted to play this character because she hasn't really thought through how to juice up the scenes that are not about the woman unraveling.
Right. Yes, I could definitely see that. I think she maybe just plays it a little too nice and straight for the first, like I said, like 30, 40 minutes, and it's just
Yeah.
waiting to get to that point. Yeah. So, I mean, we see her like tossing and turning in bed, and she really is begging her husband to just like do something, go away with her just as a family, because she's starting to feel the distance between the two of them.
Mm.
And I think, when I think back on this film and her performance, I think she really does modulate the arc of the character from that point, at least not before, but from the point of the alcoholism.
Yeah.
I think she modulates it pretty well, because I feel like there's still a little bit of that kind of hopeful feeling in her voice that maybe, like, if they can take a vacation, she can reconnect and they can make it work. And there's a little bit of that sort of like dreamy eyed feeling in the way that she looks at her husband, but it's also mixed with this real like insecurity and this doubt, like she's trying a little too hard to patch things up again, you know.
Hmm. Yeah. I think it's interesting that in the mid 40s, there's so much alcoholism in movies all of a sudden.
Yeah.
So I looked it up, and Alcoholics Anonymous was formed in the 30s, but it was in 45 and 46 where they formalized the 12 traditions and all that stuff.
That's interesting.
So it was definitely, I guess it was a post-war, realization that, people are not all right totally.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense now. Yeah.
But there's so much of it in movies, and even in movies that aren't about alcoholism, there's this like new fascination with psychology. So like you get that in Possessed where the doctor's like diagnosing her in front of you, and that's the drama.
Right.
And then and that goes all through the next decade until you get to things like Psycho, where you still have like you have to have the psychological evaluation on screen. So it's a really interesting thing about the mid-century movies to me.
Yeah, I hadn't really connected that, but that actually makes a lot of sense. I think for me, where she does probably excel the most is actually in the party scenes. There's quite a few in this movie, and we see that because like the alcohol is really flowing, like she's not really used to being around a whole lot of people anymore, and now in this situation she's acting out in these probably inappropriate ways, and it's like she's just so used to keeping so much inside, like all these different emotions that she has about her husband and the secretary Martha, played by Marsha Hunt. And I have to say, just the catty side of me was just living for all of the scenes that they had together, because
Yes.
they are just dripping with contempt.
Yeah, and they're Marsha Hunt's really good in this too.
Yeah, she's very good at playing the other woman here. At one of the parties, she just becomes completely drunk, like slurring all her words, and she has that glazed over look, and she's confronting her husband, and I think it's in front of other people too, just about how busy he is and how there's always the show must go on. And again, this is a kind of scene that could go off the rails, I think, but I think she does a good job of keying into just the sloppiness of being drunk and sort of the slurring of her words and being more direct with her emotions and having the courage to stand up to her husband. Doesn't care who's watching. I think she really gets that part right, I would say. Even if I will admit that I've read a few reviews of this film and the performance where they talk about how, like, for someone whose life is just going down the toilet, basically, she still looks pretty great. Like, even at her lowest lows, she's very glamorous.
Yeah, it's not that we're not in the mid 50s yet. So yeah, they're still very concerned with glamour. But I do, having had an alcoholic in my life, I can verify that she is fantastic at playing a drunk.
Right.
Like all the little details. It's not just the voice slurring. It's like the little details of things like their eyes refocusing at weird times, like and just, I mean, she's just there's so many details. It's kind of amazing, and that I'm sure that's why she kept getting those parts.
Yeah, she's very good, and I definitely, playing drunk is not as easy as it looks. So
Right.
but I think one of her better, quieter scenes is the part where her daughter has gotten sick and her husband is away, as always, and so she calls his hotel room, and Martha picks up the phone, of course, and she's very suspicious at this point, and so then Martha gives him the phone, and Angie just tells him, like, she got sick, but she's doing better now. There's no reason for you to come rushing back, like no reason at all, as if
Hmm.
to say, like, I don't even want you to come back at this point. Like, who cares about your family? Good riddance.
Yeah.
But I think probably the best sequence in the movie is the other party where she makes a scene, of course, and she straight up confronts Martha. And so it's like Angie is wearing this pendant that was picked out by her husband, and Martha is complimenting her on it and tells her that basically she helped to pick it out.
Right.
And Angie's just like, well, of course you did, and really is grilling her about how close she is to her husband. And I had to write down this whole exchange because it was delicious. The Martha says something like, "You're making me feel like I'm on trial." And so then Angie's just like, "I didn't think you could feel anything so human." And there's just, again, so much contempt that is so much fun to watch. And yeah, Marsha Hunt, very good at playing these kinds of characters. And it leads up to the point of her getting really wasted, and she actually slaps Martha.
Yeah.
And she's like, "Oh, everything in this house belongs to you, doesn't it, Martha?" And I think I would say you're really on her side at that moment and kind of cheering her on. And that's a credit to Susan that she does make you want to root for her, I guess, and get her to really say how she feels, even if you know, like, at the same time, a lot of this
Yeah.
behavior is caused by this deep problem that she has.
Yeah. Well, I think one scene that really stood out to me is that she's trying to get her career back on track when she realizes that her marriage sucks.
Yeah.
And then she doesn't show up when she finally gets a plum job, because she decides to get drunk instead, and she
Mm,
wakes up at this stranger's apartment.
yeah.
And I think that whole scene is just devastating. The way she performs it, the way the other act, it's an older woman who she's in her bedroom,
Hmm.
and the older woman keeps talking about her sister. My sister was like this type of thing. It's all the code for, fall down, blackout drunk.
Right. Right.
But it's very sad, and I think it's performed as realistically as it could have been at the time.
Yeah. And it does feel more raw in the emotion that it's expressing than a lot of the performances that I've been talking about, even in the 40s. So,
Yeah.
what else? I mean, let's be honest, we love a mirror scene. Um, she gets another great scene where she's looking in the mirror and just telling herself that she's pitiful, and she's just so washed up, and you see some of the self-loathing coming in. And also, I mean, I think what really helps to make this performance feel authentic is just her voice and how weathered she sounds by the end, and just that lower register is really, it just commands your attention, and it has such character to it. Even though, I mean, I don't know how old Susan Hayward was at this point, but she feels like she's really gone through a lot in her life.
She was like 30 at the time.
Yeah, so there you go.
Yeah.
So, do you have anything else from the ending you wanted to touch on from this performance?
Yeah. I mean, I like Joan Crawford. I think it's a deserving nomination.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. So we got two great performances right off the top. I would say maybe we'll go downhill from here. We'll see. But
We'll see.
the New York Times said Susan Hayward performs the boozy heroine with a solemn fastidiousness, which turns most of her scenes of drunken fumbling and heebie-jeebies into off-key burlesque. So this was not a universally loved performance because, again, she's really going for it, but she gets a nomination anyway,
Hmm.
which I find interesting. I don't know how much, I couldn't find much about the campaign for this nomination, but I think it was considered a bit of a surprise.
But it definitely sets up that she's going to be the new prestige actress.
Exactly. Yes. So looking forward to more Susan drunk / singing, or both,
Yeah.
in the future. All right. Shall we move on to our next nominee, Dorothy McGuire, for Gentleman's Agreement?
If we must.
Yes, we got to get it out of the way. Um, yeah, so we have another new actress that we haven't talked about before, but unlike Susan Hayward, this was the first and last for Dorothy McGuire. So, some background on Dorothy. she had a pretty similar path as a lot of other actresses that we've been talking about, which is that they were trained in the theater. And one interesting thing I found was that she was the understudy for Our Town. She was the understudy to Martha Scott, in fact, who would go on to be nominated for her performance in the film of Our Town. But yeah, eventually she took over for the role. She was in a show called Claudia, which got very positive reviews, and she was discovered by who else but David O. Selznick, who brought her to Hollywood, and her first film was an adaptation of that show. She was in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Spiral Staircase. So she had done a handful of notable roles before Gentleman's Agreement, but still relatively new to the scene compared to pretty much anyone else we're talking about here. So what's interesting here is that yes, she's kind of the female lead in the film, but it's also so much about the Gregory Peck character, and the film is just so centered on him, this character Phil, who is a journalist who is assigned to write about anti-Semitism, and he's asked to find an angle, and he decides to do this experiment where he pretends to be Jewish for 6 months and sees how it affects his life. And he meets Kathy, played by Dorothy, and I guess she suggested the idea of writing about it to his boss, who happens to be her uncle. So Phil and Kathy ultimately fall in love with each other, but there is some strain in the relationship because of his experiment and how it just affects her life and her relatives and her community in Connecticut, the dreaded Connecticut where I live. And they live in this little community that is exclusionary of Jews, so there's some pretty big conflict there. So yes, you've been pretty upfront with me about your feelings on Dorothy McGuire and her performance here. For the listener, though, what are your thoughts on Miss Dorothy?
I mean, I just don't get much from her, and I've seen her in several movies. I've tried, is the point. She has the lead in The Spiral Staircase, and she plays a mute girl, so it's a very typical like Oscar role, and she didn't do anything for me there. She doesn't do anything for me here. Doesn't do anything for me in Dark at the Top of the Stairs, which should, because it's a very sort of like psychosexual marital drama, and I am like the target audience for that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
But I just don't get anything from her, and she's just not for me. I don't know how else to say it, but it also feels like the type of role that would never be campaign lead now,
No.
because, as you said, it's so much about him. Although the two of the supporting women were nominated in supporting from the same movie, so you basically know that she wouldn't have been nominated at all if it were a modern movie. It would just be the other two women.
Probably.
Who are both much stronger in the movie. I mean, I do think she has a couple good moments about once she has to sort of confront her own racism.
Mm-hmm.
I think those scenes, like, I mean, this movie gets a bad rap, as most social message movies do, because they never age well, because the society always moves on.
Yeah.
But I think some of that is still very applicable to how people are now. And I think she does that pretty well, of realizing, oh, maybe I'm an anti-Semite,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of feeling shame and like she needs to change. I think she handles that part of the role very well, but not enough to be in this conversation, I don't think.
Yeah. I didn't really remember how I felt about Dorothy before I went into this rewatch. I remembered her character and the arc, but not a whole lot about the performance itself. And I feel like on this rewatch, I realized why I didn't remember it, because, yeah, she really kind of drags this movie down, honestly. And it's such a bummer, because this movie, I think, it's interesting and very well intentioned in its approach in just trying to tackle anti-Semitism head on and wanting to comment on it. Of course, there's this remove of this being from the perspective of a Christian pretending to be Jewish rather than actually telling a story from a Jewish person's perspective, so definitely dated in some aspects. But I think for her character of Kathy, like, she's actually on paper supposed to be the most interesting character in the film because of her arc and how she's so well
Hmm.
intentioned, and yet she is also complicit in not calling out her friends and family whenever they make these comments. And she thinks of herself as a good person, but it's like her silence is what makes her complicit. So there's a lot there on the page, and how she has to just navigate her own feelings with wanting to make this relationship with Phil work.
Hmm.
But I feel like she just doesn't really do anything with it. I think she
Yeah,
underplays it so
yeah,
much.
she does underplay it, and also, this is not her fault, but when you're in a movie with John Garfield and Celeste Holm and Anne Revere, you kind of have to step up your game.
Yeah,
So it's like all the supporting actors in this are just, they're just popping off the screen, and you can't have a big role like that and let, everyone else act circles around you, because it just doesn't work.
right. Yeah. And I think everything that's interesting about her is the character details are more interesting than the performance.
Yeah.
And I think the most generous reading that I could have on this performance is that she's so anonymous feeling in her approach that it does create this effect like, oh, this is just an average young woman. Like, she's nice. She seems reasonably well adjusted. There's not a lot on the surface that makes her stand out in like a negative way. And because she's so much of a blank slate, you can almost project your own feelings onto her, and you see how even the most normal, well intentioned people can actually be the ones who are perpetuating this kind of prejudice.
Yeah.
And if that was the direction that Elia Kazan gave to her, then I get why there's not a lot of defining features there.
Hmm.
But at the same time, she just has such a lack of screen presence, honestly,
Yeah.
that you're not
And
even compelled by her in that way.
yeah, and I really doubt that that's what Elia
Yeah,
because
exactly.
most of his movies, like, the acting is, in terms of his directorial gifts, like, he's very gifted with actors.
Right. And I just feel like there should be a more emotional arc for this character than it ends up being. And it should be more of a catharsis or something where when she does realize the error of her ways. But that just doesn't really happen. And yeah, I mean, truly watching the film, I feel like every other actress in the film was giving a more interesting performance than
Yeah.
Dorothy. Obviously, Celeste Holm, who wins the supporting actress, Anne Revere, great character actress, love her. Even the secretary who works at the office, who only has a few scenes,
Hmm.
like, who else? Like, yeah, John Garfield, baby Dean Stockwell is
Yeah.
giving more than what Dorothy's doing. So, yeah, not really a fan of her work here, but I do want to just touch on a few things from the film a little bit and see if we can get something from the performance. Um, Again, the film is mostly from Gregory Peck's perspective, which does put her at a disadvantage, but he meets her at a party. Again, she's average, unassuming. She has a kind of demure quality about her, and the way she speaks almost reminds me of like Jennifer Jones and how she would deliver lines in this more reserved kind of way, like really underplaying it. And we see Phil start to fall in love with her, but I just never really felt the chemistry there.
No, I mean, it's like, what does he see in her?
Right. That's the
Especially
thing.
because, like, he meets Celeste Holm very early, who's a big flirt,
Yeah.
and he doesn't seem interested at all. And it's like,
Right. And
but
she's
Celeste
great.
Holm is, yeah, she's so dynamic, and she's pretty. Like,
Yeah. And then not to get too far ahead, but I feel like that the film really just like drops her completely.
yeah,
Like, we don't even check in on any sort of resolution for that character, which is very just like it leaves you with an icky feeling personally.
yeah,
Um, But I guess the first real like meaty scene for her is when they're talking about the little experiment and she's wondering if he actually is Jewish, and it's this back and forth that they have where she really seems a little too interested in wanting to see if he really is a Jew, and then kind of backpedals and doing that classic thing where it's like they know they've accidentally tipped their hand a little too much, where she's like, not that there's anything wrong with that, and
Right.
the classic thing. And to her credit, I think she does at least register the kind of calculations that she's making in her mind about like, what do I say next, and how do I make this situation not as awkward that it already is, which is consistent with this character and how she doesn't want to cause waves. And you could definitely sense that she doesn't think of herself as a bad person, but
Right.
there is that hint of ignorance there. So, I mean, that's at least a decent scene for her, not blown away by it, but I'm like, I understand what you're going for at least.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was saying earlier
Yeah.
about I think that detail of the character I think she does pretty well with, but doing one detail of a character pretty well should not earn you a Best Actress nomination. I
Yeah.
mean, it very much feels like this is your front runner for Best Picture, therefore give it all the nominations.
Yes. Definitely right movie, right time for Dorothy, I think. So, I mean, if you look at it in a more favorable light, you could say that it's like the banality of evil kind of thing. Like she
Yeah,
plays
yeah.
it so normally and without making her seem like a monster that it does end up speaking to how this prejudice has been allowed to go on for so long because of people like her who don't speak up and they don't say anything. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So, yeah, otherwise, I mean, Celeste really overshadows her, like I said. A lot of scenes that I feel like should impact me more uh, just don't. Like, when there's a scene where she's like calling him on the phone and she says she had it out with her sister, and it's just like not convincing at all. And she has another scene where they're back in their hometown of Connecticut, and she's talking about how she just poured all her hopes into her house, but she knew it was over, and because she's a divorcee, so she has this past. And even
Hmm.
there, I'm like feeling sleepy by this point, honestly. Even though this is supposed to be such a revealing character moment, I'm just like, you're not giving me anything. Go on, girl, give us nothing. That's truly how it felt.
Yeah,
But
and there's even stuff like I think Gregory Peck is pretty good in this movie, and
yeah.
there's even stuff with him like he is kind of arrogant and
Hmm.
a total mansplainer.
Yeah.
So there's not even like she doesn't even work out three-dimensional reactions to him. Like the fact that even if you're the person in the wrong, which she is through most of the movie,
Hmm.
you would still she doesn't even really you could still fill in stuff like being irritated at somebody who's always telling you that you're wrong.
Right.
And like you don't even really see that. She just sort of like she just doesn't hold her own in the scene.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of what we were talking about with Ingrid Bergman for Whom the Bell Tolls, personally,
Mhm.
where I just feel like whenever she's just having to react to things and not be the driver of the scene, it's sort of like there's nothing much going on there. So,
Not the finest hour, no.
yeah. So, yeah, I mean, she obviously has the scene at the end where she's talking with John Garfield playing Dave, who is a Jew who is a friend of Gregory Peck, and really sort of coaching her through like why just letting her see the error of her ways. But again, I just don't really feel anything from it, and I feel like the ending is just really undeserved of her getting this like reconciliation with Gregory Peck. And
Hmm.
it just leaves me unsatisfied by the end. So, yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about with this movie, but not a lot of it has to do with Dorothy.
Right.
I assume you don't have anything else.
I do not know.
Okay. Well, we tried. So, Variety said Dorothy McGuire is dramatically and emotionally compelling as Kathy, adding considerable scope and depth to anything she had done heretofore. Don't necessarily agree, but I also haven't seen a lot of the things that she did before this, so maybe this was a plum role in that sense. But otherwise, yeah. So, let's move on to our last losing nominee. It's a big one here. Rosalind Russell for Mourning Becomes Electra. So much to get into with this one. This is more of Rosalind Russell going for a big dramatic role after Sister Kenny the previous year, and this film is based on a play by Eugene O'Neill, which is one of those just massive plays like Angels in America that ran for about 6 hours on the stage. Very weighty text, very much in the vein of a Greek tragedy. It's about a family in the 1800s, around the time of the Civil War, where it centers on her character of Lavinia, who goes by Vinny for short. And she's in love with this sea captain, Adam, who happens to be having an affair with her mother, Christine, played by Katina Paxanu, speaking of For Whom the Bell Tolls.
Yeah.
Yeah, so her mother is cheating on her father, and Lavinia hopes to get back at her and wants her to end the relationship, but it doesn't happen. There's this huge spiral of events that leaves a lot of people dead. Maybe we'll unpack some of this dense plot as we talk about it, but it's interesting because apparently, I guess Roz did not actually want this part of Lavinia. She actually wanted to play Christine, who is a little bit closer to her age, but the director really wanted her for Lavinia. So there you have it. Apparently, it was a very tumultuous set, a lot to unpack. Tell me your thoughts on this performance from Roz, and also what your thoughts are on her as an actress.
Well, I understand why she lost. I'll just
Mm,
start with that.
okay.
My thing with Rosalind Russell, it's like it's so interesting that this isn't like a stellar Best Actress year or anything, but we have three like gay favorites among like actresses of that era,
Yeah.
all in one category. But Rosalind Russell's strength was always comedy, and I feel like when she does, I mean, she's great in Auntie Mame, she's great in My Sister Eileen, but and the women, of course. But I feel like when she does drama, it's too presentational. It's like I'm gonna throw my chin up to show that I'm proud and just hold my face there. And there's a lot of like sort of very stiff trying to express an emotion but not expressing multiple things at once. So it feels like
Mm,
if Joan Crawford didn't have as much skill as Joan Crawford has, so the fact that she's stony faced a lot of times, but you can a lot under. And I feel like it's kind of like that, only without the bubbling under. So I just felt like I was getting one thing from her in every single scene
mm.
or in every single line, just like I'm mad or I'm in love or I'm jealous. Like it just felt flat to me in terms of her performance.
Yeah, she's doing a lot of actressing here, as we like to say.
Yeah.
Huge, just like paragraphs of dialogue and monologues, delving into some dark stuff. And I would say it's impressive on a technical level, but yeah, I sort of wish I cared more. And I think a lot of it comes down to the direction, which I think is just as basic as it gets. Just little to no flair for visuals. It really feels like a stage play. There's not
Hmm.
all that much creativity in terms of blocking and just creating like a real visual language to really have you immersed in this story. And because there's so much text to get through, I think it just becomes so bogged down in these huge dialogue scenes that work fine on the stage, I'm sure, but for a film, it's so inert. Like, even though there's so much going on in this story, there's murder and revenge and this weird twisted family dynamic, and it should be riveting, but it's just not.
You know what it reminded me of? Like, I totally agree with what you're saying. And what it reminded me of was the film version of August Osage County,
Oh
where
God. Yes.
you take this like really epic play and you just make it flat
Yeah.
because like, the director doesn't have any point of view and it's just kind of there. And then the actors have to sort of like flail around trying to get the juice out of it, trying to wring any sort of flavor out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's
And
a
I just didn't feel like she could.
right. Well, I do think that the director, Dudley Nichols, uh, probably does fail all of the actors here. Granted, he does allow the acting to really come to the fore in that sense. But as far as the story and the meaning behind it all, you can have the best material in the world. And if you stage it poorly, it's just not going to have the impact that you want it to have. So
Hmm.
that's generally my problem with the movie itself. And where she fits into it is that she's just too old for this role. I'm sorry, but it's the
Hmm.
same thing I said with Norma Shearer in Romeo and Juliet. I feel like she just has such a maturity by this point. She's 40 years old filming this movie, where the character is supposed to be like at least 10 years younger, I think, and that's being generous. And Katina Paxanu I looked this up, is she's only 7 years older than Roz.
Yeah.
So as far as creating like a mother-daughter dynamic, they feel more like sisters who hate each other more than
Yeah,
a mother
I
and
was just
daughter.
gonna say that, but that has kind of I don't know their first scene where they go at each other for the first time and sort of uh unearth all this family drama about how she never really loved her daughter and stuff like that. I mean, it's pretty heavy for a first scene together.
Yeah.
Um, I kind of liked that they were close in age for that scene, but only in a sort of like a meta way.
Hmm.
Like it's just like the movie's only like entertaining to watch from a very sort of detached
Yeah.
sense.
And it feels like a little, predecessor to Baby Jane in certain respects. But when I was watching the film and this performance, speaking of that, I was like, this is reminding me of something that I can't quite put my finger on. And then it just clicked into place that, oh, this is Rosalind Russell trying to do Betty Davis. Because this is 1,000% a Betty Davis role that she would have played, especially in the early 40s. This kind of just like
Mm.
tempestuous woman, very selfish and vain. And there's a fierceness there with Betty that I don't know if Roz fully has, if I'm being honest.
Well, she has it in comedy. She can
Yes,
do that sort of like fierce, formidable woman, but in
right.
comedy.
In comedy specifically, right. But there's just like a severity in her screen presence here that I can say that we haven't really seen it before from Roz, which is interesting. And it's very much there from the beginning, where she's staring out the window at her mother kissing Adam. And there's just like a stiffness and a coldness to the approach that definitely allows an audience at 1947 to see her in a different light than they're used to. And she's just like boiling with fury, and there's so much coldness even in her interactions with the Kirk Douglas character, Peter, and her saying that she doesn't want to change the dynamic of their relationship because he really wants to be with her, but she just wants to be friends because she obviously has this other longing for Adam. And yeah, I feel like in a lot of her scenes with her mother, especially, there's kind of a grit in her voice that's very commanding.
Hmm.
But again, to go back to it, she just reads as older, especially when she really digs into that grit in her voice. That it does.
Yeah.
It just feels like two sisters who are feuding more than anything else. And even when she realizes that her mother always hated her father, and she says at one point, she says, "I was born of your disgust." Uh,
Yeah.
I like those little moments because I've talked about this before, but I think she does have a knack for knowing how to really deliver a punchline, which obviously works
Hmm.
the best in comedy, but in her dramatic performances, I think she really does. She can sort of like get to that escalation point very well.
Yeah, I think the more I've seen of like the early work, the more I'm always like just, not excited about the dramatic work. Like there's
Yeah.
this movie that was nominated for Night Must Fall. That was nominated for, a couple acting Oscars, not her though. And she has like the lead role. And it should be this really rich, psychosexual role where you're getting all these feelings that she has about the different people in the room. It's a very like a four character movie.
Hmm.
And there's just not much like sort of complexity to it. I don't know I don't know why. Because she can be so fun in roles, but I almost always think she's lacking in sort of layers when she does drama.
Yeah. Definitely feels like surface level readings of
Yeah.
scenes. I would agree. Yeah. But let's just touch on the bigger plot points here and how she handles them. We have this big development at the end of the first act where her father is finally back from fighting in the war and she's just very relieved and she's just bursting to tell him about what's been going on with Christine and with Adam and this whole fraught dynamic, but she can't bring herself to do it and she just says goodnight and bursts into tears, which is another thing that should be a big moment, but it feels a little phony.
Hmm.
I think it also speaks to one of my other problems with the performance, which is that she's kind of always going big. And yes, it's an over the top character, but yeah, I don't know how much nuance she's really bringing to it. So and it pains me to say that because I love Roz, but I feel
Yeah.
like I can feel the straining here. And then like the big moment where her mother poisons her father, a very raw moment where it's her big loud reaction that does feel appropriate and it is affecting. And I did love the her big delivery on this line that I wrote down where she's shouting at her mother and she's like, "You think you'll be free to marry Adam, but you won't. Not while I'm alive." It's just a lot of these big declarative statements that, again, I like the big punchline kind of moments from her, but otherwise, yeah, there's not a whole lot, which is it's weird for this huge, big movie that's over 2.5 hours. It feels like there's weirdly not a lot to talk about outside of that surface level reading she has of the material, you know.
I mean, it's interesting. He didn't really direct. Uh, the director here didn't really keep directing.
Yeah.
Two movies with her was basically it. And mostly he was like a screenwriter.
Yeah. And I mean, from what I've read about the production here, I don't blame him. Because apparently it was just a very tumultuous set. Like Katina Paxanu, Roz said herself that she was always just like having these big going on these tears and screaming and yelling all around the set. And Michael Redgrave, who plays her brother, is they didn't have the best chemistry together. So it was a mess overall. And you can
Yeah,
probably see that. Yeah.
yeah. It
But
was the last movie he directed, so
yeah. You can definitely sense that this is a last movie for someone. Um, just like I've had enough. I can't do this anymore. But to talk about the second act, we have this big arrival of her brother, played by Michael Redgrave, also gets the Oscar nomination for this, and he's a bit of a mama's boy. But she wants to warn him first about what's been going on. She's like, "Don't believe mother. Wait till you talk to me." And eventually they catch their mother going off with Adam on the boat, and so they stage this big scheme to kill him and make it look like a robbery. And she's just increasingly becoming meaner and more selfish and like even mocking her brother about believing their mother. And she's like, "Oh, you're going to become her crybaby again." And those are the moments where I do believe her as this character, weirdly enough. Like it's kind of an inconsistent performance in that way where she does have moments that are truly, you know, piercing and just powerful, but the murder goes down and her mother hears about it and she's just inconsolable. And then we have the moment where Roz is getting what I would say is her little fox's moment, kind of, where she's outside of the house and just like looking off into the distance, very cold. And we hear this gunshot, which can only be her mother killing herself. And she does have a reaction to it, but it's a very chilling scene, which then leads to the last part of the film. So this is an exhausting movie.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about it because, like, I don't want to diss Roz too much because, of course, she's a delight.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not, well, maybe it is terrible in some parts, but like, she, like you're saying, she can hit a line,
Yeah.
She's a professional,
Right.
and
Right.
she's a star. So she can carry it. It's not a question of like her screen presence or anything. It's just like she feels really miscast to me.
Exactly. That's the like the fundamental problem is she probably shouldn't be playing this role. And it would be interesting to maybe see her as Christine. But do you have any feelings on the last act of her performance where she really gets to give like so much range, and she feels lighter just because she's more free in her body language after they've gone off to this island where she's had like this transformative experience, but she's still unnerved, I think, by everything that's happened and is just haunted by all the literally like all the carnage that's happened around them.
Yeah, I don't have a lot more to add. Like, I don't think she's bad. I like there's a lot of scenes that she's fine in. It's just,
Yeah,
it's too uneven for me to consider. Like, I can't imagine how people thought she was going to win other than being perhaps overdue.
well, yeah, that was the big part of it, I would say. So we will definitely get to that. But yeah, I wish that I had a little more to talk about here, but I will just sort of agree that it's so surface level, her reading of the material, that more than anything, I'm just sort of disappointed because I wanted her to dig deeper because this is such a wild, fascinating character. But I feel like we just got like the most basic version of that, which pains me to say as a fan of hers. So, but the New York Times said Rosalind Russell, for all her arrogant poses and icy attitudes, never transmits the huge malevolence and the tortured tragedy of the daughter's soul. So, this is another one that was mixed reviews, to put it lightly. It was a box office failure because it was this lumbering, like roadshow style film that was a lot to ask of the audience in 1947. So sadly, this is one of those interesting failures for me, more so than an interesting film. So shall we get to our big winner, Loretta Young?
Let's do it.
All right. So she's winning on her first nomination, but this is not like a Star is Born type of situation we have here. She had actually first started acting when she was a child in the 1910s, although a lot of the earlier films are hard to find or they're just lost. But she worked a lot starting from about 1927 all the way through 20 years later. Multiple films every single year, not always leads, but just a huge resume. And when we get to the 40s is when she really starts to get some attention for her work. She was in the Orson Welles film The Stranger in 1946, which really boosted her profile. And then here with Farmer's Daughter coming out the same year also as The Bishop's Wife, which is nominated for Best Picture. This was really her prime in film, at least. And she had like a kind of glamorous good girl image. And in this film, it's based on a play. And apparently they wanted Ingrid Bergman for this role because it's a Swedish American part, which would suit her perfectly. But she turned it down. And I guess Dorothy McGuire might have also been in the mix, but that didn't happen. And it landed with Loretta, who said that she was kind of scared to attempt this Swedish accent, but she hired the coach who helped Ingrid Bergman to lose her Swedish accent. And so
That's funny.
that's interesting. Um, but the film, it's about a young woman named Katie, played by Loretta, who is indeed a farmer's daughter who goes to the city to become a nurse, but she eventually ends up working for as a maid for this political power broker, played by Ethel Barrymore. And she falls in love with her son, Glenn, played by Joseph Cotton. Here he is again. And she proves that she has the kind of common sense and just forthright attitude to lend advice to people. And through this big series of events, she ends up being the replacement candidate for a politician that recently died. And yeah, that's basically the story. Kind of a rags to riches. So let's talk about it. Our big winner, Loretta Young. What do you think of her, Loretta herself, and her as the Oscar winner this year?
I mean, I don't have a lot of feelings about Loretta Young,
Mm-hmm.
actually, even though I've seen this twice. I but my mom really loved Loretta Young. So I grew up knowing that it was my mom's favorite actor, and I think that was more from like her TV show later on.
Yeah.
And so my parents actually took me. We had a repertory house near where I grew up in Detroit, that would show old movies every weekend. And so I that's how I saw a lot of these older films. And they took me to see Farmer's Daughter because they liked Loretta Young.
Hmm.
So I saw it when I was a kid. So I did not remember, but I did not remember it at all. I was so shocked watching it this time how crazy it is. Like it is literally like a crazy movie. Like the plot makes no sense. All the characters are bizarre.
Yeah.
And it just kind of it's like a movie. Like there's nowhere where it touches reality, you know. And it's sort of a romantic comedy, but then it's also like a inspiring political drama. It's all over the place. Really weird movie. Um,
Yeah.
and she's fine. Like, but it's one of those things where I think it was a hit. I don't really recall the reception of it, but I think it's more one of those things, an Oscar win because she had a good year because she was also in The Bishop's Wife, of course.
Yeah. I think this is one of those wins where in a vacuum, it's sort of baffling that she won an Oscar for this performance, I would say.
Uh-huh.
But then when you look at the four other nominees, all of them playing characters that are more difficult to embrace, it starts to make sense. We'll get to that again a little later. I don't necessarily think that she's bad in this, but I really don't think that there's much of anything she's doing that I haven't seen before from other performances like this and characters that are, spunky and underdog types. Like
Right.
I really do think that it's more the role than it is how she embodied it that she won in the end. Again, not to get too ahead of ourselves, but I think looking at the performance, regardless of the competition, it's
Hmm.
decent. It's capable. I don't have that much of a problem with it, but I feel like this is a role that requires like a true comedic performer who can excel in this kind of, like you're saying, sort of just heightened scenario where things are happening that
Right.
don't seem like have any semblance of reality. And Loretta
Yeah.
Young, I think, is a little too vacant for me, especially in this part.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's smart that she underplays the material a little bit just so that it doesn't become like a total cartoon, basically. Um, but this is not a performance that I would say inspires a lot of passion for me. I do think the film has actually some interesting ideas about like politics, and it's easy to sort of root for her as this voice of the people. So I don't know. I hate to say it because I think she's much better than Dorothy McGuire. But it's a little bit of a similar situation where the character is more interesting than the performance.
Yeah. And what you're saying actually makes a lot of sense to me about this sort of more, it needs more comic energy. Like it made me think
Yeah.
it's like the kind of screwball elements are there, but it's not as silly as it should be given the plot.
Yeah.
I think I mean, she would be the absolute wrong for this for other reasons, but it made me think of someone like Barbara Stanwyck, who
Yeah.
who, their comic energy is like a little like unpredictable.
Hmm.
But they can also do the drama stuff. Like, I don't think Barbara would be right for this, but like it's that sort of thing where they can interject strange comedic things, because I feel like Loretta does not. I feel like there's a lot of opportunity for physical comedy, for example, that she
Hmm.
just doesn't take.
Right.
Like one of the early scenes, like she has to wear this maid uniform that doesn't fit her at all, and it just felt like this scene is dying for a laugh,
Yeah.
and she's not doing anything with her body to make it funny. Um, and then she has these skating scenes, which technically could have these ice skating scenes that technically could have some comic energy that don't really.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's not a bad performance. It's just kind of like, because of the slate of performers, she won.
Right. Yeah. Again, I hate to say got lucky, but just the combination would only lead
Yeah,
to her winning this year in particular. So, yeah. Also, I don't know about you, but I feel like the film is a little too in love with her character. And I don't
yeah,
want to say like it infantilizes her, because it does give her the opportunity to, voice her ideas in a mature way. But I feel like it really just indulges in this whole idea of, look how wacky it is that we have this Swedish farmer's daughter who's speaking common sense, and look at how funny and blunt she is, and here she is running through the snow for exercise. How weird. Like, here she is giving a Swedish massage to Joseph Cotton. And
right.
I just wanted like a little more variety in the kinds of scenes and the material that she's asked to deliver, because it really starts to feel kind of one note. Like, all the scenes have this, every scene kind of has the same dynamic where she's a little too blunt about certain things, and everyone's just sort of reacting to her kind of like in awe of her, like, oh my god, this mysterious Swedish woman who showed up and is going to suddenly fix everything. Like, I don't love that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much like othering, like
Yeah,
exoticizing Swedish family. Yeah,
exactly.
and it probably doesn't help that I mean, they maybe could have curtailed that a little bit with Swedish actors, but like all the accents are kind of all over the place.
Yeah,
Like her
including
brothers,
hers.
like yeah, and her
But
brothers especially. It's like
yeah,
some of them sound like Californians, some sound like they're trying to do an accent. Like
yeah.
Lex Barker, future Tarzan, he's very attractive, but I don't know about his accent, that sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, I think even for her, it's a little inconsistent. We definitely get what her approach is just right away, where she's going away from the farm and she's like, "Thank you, Papa," and it's
Yeah.
it's pretty convincing. But I do think that her own voice, like her own accent, does come out over time, where she really starts to sound like more American as the film is going on.
Yeah.
I don't know if that probably wasn't a specific choice for her to do that, but yeah. Also, she's very, doe-eyed and innocent, and we see her dealing with this swindler who takes away all her money on the trip to the big city, and she gets kind of like a fun moment where she's cursing him out in Swedish, I think, and is
Yeah.
like tossing this huge jug of water in his face. And I feel like she has a lot of those kinds of impactful moments that would make an audience just react. Like when she's at the house and she's just listing everything she's able to do, and she's like, I can wait tables
Right.
and I can preserve meats and making a drink called glug, and just like going in this matter of fact way, not really getting like the social cues of everything. Like, this is all very, I almost want to say low hanging fruit for just the audience to be charmed by her, this humble country girl sort of thing. For me, it's just that she only really has this one mode, and I'm not all
Mhm.
that taken with the one mode, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
get
I
it.
mean, it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's a very like it's an easily likable performance, but it does like it made me think of like this is going to be a really weird comparison, but the two performances I thought of were Sandra Bullock in The Blind Side because it's just about it's just about the somebody being like a star and like telling everybody what's what and always being the one that's right. And
Yeah.
it's just like you win because it's like your big hit.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one was Jennifer Jones' The Song of Bernadette, because it's clear
Right.
that back then they used to, they still like this stuff, don't get me wrong, but like the inspiring saintly woman was
Yes.
a bigger deal back then.
Right. And yeah, I mean, like, speaking of what I was saying, like, doing the one particular thing right in the case of Jennifer Jones, I think she really excelled in that film.
Yeah.
Whereas here, I'm just like not all that taken with it, to be honest. But
Mm.
I guess getting into the political aspect in the second half, I'd say you do find yourself rooting for this character just because the common sense that she brings to everything and how she's really fighting for the people,
Yeah.
and she's not just giving these empty promises. A lot of this starts to feel like a Frank Capra movie with the
Yeah,
sort of
totally.
idealism of this outsider who's come in to really shake things up. And there's this whole plot line where the power brokers they're all getting together to push this one candidate who's actually kind of corrupt, and she openly calls him out at a town hall. And I think that's a pretty good scene for her where she's really voicing her anger in that moment, but also still kind of keeping it consistent with the character, like the cool, calm, and collected, blunt thing that she does. That's probably one of the only real highlight moments for me, but otherwise cute, charming, forgettable, and then it won an Oscar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a charming performance. I just wish it had, since she won, I just wish there was a little more to recommend it.
Yes, we thought that there would be more. Yes. The New York Times said, as the beautiful Swedish domestic, Loretta Young is a bit lean and lank, but the meat in her role is so substantial that she subsists on it comfortably. Which pretty much sums up what we've been talking about. Uh, so let's just transition into talking about this Oscar race. We had an interesting dynamic here where Loretta Young was not the obvious frontrunner like we've seen for most of the 40s that we've talked about. So the publicist Henry Rogers had actually worked on the campaign for Joan Crawford, for Mildred Pierce, and Olivia de Havilland for To Each His Own, which is the previous two Best Actress winners. He decides that Rosalind Russell is the one with the big role, and he's going to back her. And I guess he persuaded the bettors in Vegas to list her as the favorite of Best Actress. So that happened. She got all these special tributes. She got a Golden Globe. She had a bunch of ads in the trades. And then something happened here. And for Loretta Young, I mean, well, I guess we should mention that RKO was, the producer on both of these films, but they were more invested in The Farmer's Daughter.
Hmm.
So they really were spearheading the campaign for Loretta. But I guess Daily Variety printed some percentages of the vote because they would always do the informal ballots of Academy members. And they listed Loretta Young in fourth place.
Oh, wow.
And not only that, but they also misprinted that her nomination was for The Bishop's Wife. So it was kind of a mess leading up to the Oscars. But why do we think Loretta Young is our big winner ultimately? And do we think that Rosalind Russell actually was the contender that she was propped up to be?
I think she probably was because even though I don't think the performance is necessarily good, um, you know, even back then narratives mattered and like she was considered overdue and everybody expected her to win, which means, people probably voted for her. But I also think it meant she was just a really super weak front runner.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a lot of passion for the performance. I mean, because people, as you said, it was a flop. So I think that there was just, I think she was probably in second, but I'm assuming it's one of those years where there wasn't just a lot of passion in general. And so it's, the votes were spread around for Best Actress.
So I'm wondering if there's something about the kind of performance this is that is a little bit of an apple in a barrel of oranges for Loretta Young,
Yeah.
where like Roz and Joan Crawford and Susan Hayward are like very similar types, right?
Yeah.
And Dorothy McGuire, I just feel like was never winning for that performance, so I feel
Right.
like I could just sort of take her out of it. But yeah, I think Loretta sort of rose to the top as this very clear alternative, likable type of character compared to these darker characters that, yeah, ultimately, even if the performance is kind of forgettable, it makes sense within the context of this very specific year.
And it's probably worth noting that, Rosalind had won 2 Golden Globes in a row at this point.
Yep.
So that's why I was saying like the overdue thing, and also the Golden Globes didn't have comedy yet. So if they had, I think you would have probably seen that Loretta Young was more potent threat than people thought.
Well, when we get to the Oscar ceremony itself, Frederick March announced it. And from what I read, I don't know how true it is, but apparently he started to say Rosalind because it was such a foregone conclusion that she was going to win. And also, I guess people were getting up to leave because they knew it was going to be her. So, why not beat the traffic, leave early? But yeah, and Luella Parsons reported that she was behind Roz, and this is what she wrote. She said, "Never as long as I live will I forget that almost involuntary motion she made of leaning forward, almost rising from her seat."
Ouch.
Yeah. So the framing of it is that it was such a foregone conclusion that she was going to win that she basically got up even before the announcement was made. Like, here I am, I'm going to go accept my trophy. And then here we have it. And so when Loretta does win, I guess Roz sort of did transition into just being like, oh, I'm just giving you a standing ovation. But
Right.
so, very smoothly go into that. But yeah, it's a wild race that really was sort of the highlight really of the whole Oscars of this year. Like the Best Picture announcement was completely overshadowed by this shocking upset. And what's fun about this is that we haven't really had a proper upset win really yet that we've talked about. So this will be first of many.
Oh, for Best Actress, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. But Loretta was completely shocked by it. I also read that Susan Hayward made a mention. She said, I'll be nominated for an Oscar again. Maybe not next year. Maybe I'll have to wait until the 50s, but I intend to win someday. That's my goal. And you know what?
Well,
she was right.
Put in her role. Yeah. She was
Yeah.
definitely an Oscar actress. Yeah.
Exactly. And then one other quote is from Loretta, which is, it made me feel bad. But Loretta said, my only regret about the whole thing is Roz Russell. And don't say poor Roz, because she will go on to win an Academy Award, and then some. But it was cruel for the polls to come out and say that she was going to win. Unfortunately, Loretta's prediction was not correct. She would not win an Academy Award.
Yes.
But
although she's better at her next nomination's much better.
Yes, exactly. Which will be quite a few years from now when I get to her. But yeah. So let's transition into some Twitter questions that we got. This is from this is interesting because it's something you mentioned earlier. GTA James said, is this the classic era's Sandra Bullock blindside win? An actress in a feel-good movie being rewarded for a career of likable performances.
So I would say yes, since I already mentioned that.
Yeah.
I read your mind through the internet.
Right. Yeah, and I do get the comparison. I mean, it was a foregone conclusion that Sandra was winning, which is like the opposite of Loretta here, but yeah, I could see it. Like she'd really established herself as a likable presence. Maybe not like a powerhouse actress, but someone that the industry really liked. So there you go.
Yeah.
Our friend Fritz says, was presenter Frederick March confused and read the last name on the teleprompter as the winner?
I mean, didn't people say that about about the Marissa Tomei win too?
Yes, that whole conspiracy
um,
theory. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Who can know?
Yeah. I mean, apparently he read like a physical card and said it. So no, we're not going to spread a conspiracy theory here. Loretta was the proper winner. K Flea 208 said Ingrid Bergman apparently turned down the role of Katrine in Farmer's Daughter, which Loretta Young won for. Had Bergman done the role, would she have won lead this year or even been nominated?
That's a really good question.
Probably would have been nominated at the very least. She was very popular at this time.
Yeah. And there didn't like the movies that were up for the awards didn't really have like there weren't a lot of like big names that were probably close to being nominated. So yeah, I would say yes too. I don't know about winning though. I think it changes the dynamic.
Right. I agree with that. I mean, I do think that she probably would have been better in the role. I think she had such a knack for comedy too. Like I loved her in Bells of St. Mary's, Cactus Flower. Like she has a lot of great comedic performances. So I think she would have killed it, but probably not another win quite yet. Andrew Carden said, had Ingrid won in 1945, could Joan Crawford have actually triumphed here?
To that, I would say yes.
Yeah, I could see it, right?
Because, like, that was her big comeback. It would have owed her if she had lost for years.
I think she would have also definitely gone into campaign overdrive to win this time. Yeah, it's such a Beatty role that I feel like, yeah, she could have done it. Dante Facchetti said, isn't it obvious that Joan Crawford did the most acting?
Oh, I think Susan Hayward would have a word for that.
I mean,
I think she would protest.
Yeah, Roz would too. I mean, this is a category with three performances that you could say have the most acting, and in another year that doesn't have the three of them, maybe one of them would have won. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
split votes are a fun thing for conspiracy theories, right?
Yes. Exactly.
Maybe they were all too similar of roles.
Yeah. John T. said, this is the start of what would be a decade-long campaign to get Susan Hayward her Oscar. If she wins off the bat, how many of her subsequent nominations materialize? Does she still win in 1958?
That's a good question. Now I have to remind myself, sorry, I'm looking it up. I'm 47's in my brain because I've been watching all these movies in the past couple of days.
Yeah.
Which throws me off of my basic Oscar knowledge. 58. No, Rosalind Russell, I bet you would have won.
Yeah, ironically.
Yeah, for Auntie Mame.
Yeah, I don't know that she wins in 1958 because I think a part of that was just a culmination for Susan Hayward after 5 nominations.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think, you're probably right. Roz would have won that. What a shame. Fritz said, was Susan the best drunk in classic Hollywood?
Well, You've already heard my opinion on that. I say yes.
Yes, I agree. She's like scary good at it. I'll just say that. Christoph N. said, are you absolutely sure Dorothy McGuire is even in Gentleman's Agreement? Because I don't remember her at all. Shady.
Shady but true.
Yes. Well, according to the records, she is in fact nominated. But yes. Fritz, to pile on here, Fritz said, is Dorothy McGuire overshadowed by everyone in her own movie? Again, yes.
Yeah. Even June Havoc in the really small secretary part.
Exactly. Right? Luke Val said, do you think Dorothy McGuire is in the right category? And if not, do you think she would have deserved to be nominated in supporting?
I mean, I think it's one of those roles that you could read either way. I would have been fine with calling her supporting, but I would never have nominated her.
In either category, yeah. I guess in the sense that there's so many supporting actresses in the film, that Dorothy, I
Yeah.
guess, is the most prominent. So I guess I'm fine with her being in lead, but no, I don't think she deserved a nomination in supporting if she was campaign there.
Fourth best of the four women.
Right, right. Miles McHale said Celeste Holm has a whopper of an Oscar clip in Gentleman's Agreement. Is the reason Dorothy McGuire didn't win because she doesn't? No, I think the reason Dorothy McGuire didn't win is because she was not good in the movie. Period. Owen Daly said, if you were to swap any of the actresses into one of their co-nominees' roles, who do you think would have been most effective? Well, Owen suggested Joan Crawford would have been great in Smash Up.
Yeah, Susan and Hayward could have done Possessed too.
Yeah. They should swap. Yeah. How about this? Loretta Young in Gentleman's Agreement.
Dorothy McGuire in Mourning Becomes Electra.
Oh my god.
since the movie's a wash anyways.
That would be a lot for her to shoulder. My goodness. All right. Well, Christoph N. said, why did it take the Academy another 3 years to nominate Deborah Kerr for the first time when she really should have been nominated here for Black Narcissus?
That is a really good question because I was going to bring up Black Narcissus because it's so fantastic and she's so good in it. Mm-hmm. But I mean, we've seen that in modern times, right? It's like certain actors. It's like, why haven't they nominated them yet? And then once they do, they're like, you're part of the club.
Right. I don't know. Maybe there was still a certain feeling about like homegrown stars, like Hollywood people. I don't know if Deborah Kerr was really there yet as a Hollywood presence quite yet.
Yeah, she was still very much British actress at that point.
Yeah. And that was kind of a thing in the 40s. So Karen Walker Wannabe said, honestly, this felt like Roz's best chance. Is it her best role or nomination?
No.
Not her best role, not her best nomination. But the other part of the question is it the closest that she came to winning? Maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
It wasn't meant to be, apparently. I mean, I could still see her coming close for Auntie Mame, but yeah, this was probably the one if there was ever going to be a time for her. Christoph N. said, if Roz Russell had won this, would this be one of the most reviled Oscar wins in the history of the category, an obvious career award for a decidedly meh film that wasn't even popular back then, or would we all just shrug because the entire slate is somewhat lukewarm this year?
I'm not sure it would be that reviled because I don't think people would have watched it. You know, it's like one of those ones people are like, oh, Russell, she's great. You know, like they would have let the reputation do the work and not even seen the movie.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I don't think there's a performance here that people would say should have won instead. I don't know if this would be a reviled win in that way. So it's just kind of a weaker year overall, I would say. Chelsea said, Rosalind Russell is so hot, but her nominations are decidedly not hot. What should she have been honored for? His Girl Friday.
Think everybody knows that. Yeah, His Girl Friday.
That was the one, and I think she should have won. Sorry to Ginger Rogers. Brian Ayrton said, if you were Rosalind Russell, how would you have disguised standing up? Probably the way that she did it, just by pretending that I was giving a standing ovation. Fritz said, the most important question, does Mourning become Electra?
In this case, no.
Yeah, that's a very convoluted title meaning. I did have to look it up just to verify exactly what Mourning Becomes Electra actually means. But, and then they said, Rosalind Russell, do you prefer her in comedies or dramas? Definitely comedies, we mentioned that. Loretta Young, do you prefer her in comedies or dramas? Neither.
I don't know that I've seen her in dramas. Like, because like her other nomination's also a comedy.
Yeah, Come to the Stable. Yeah. That's going to be fun. 2 more. Oh, this is another Deborah Carr one. Eric Maxwell Brunn said, should Deborah Carr have been nominated for Black Narcissus? If so, who would you knock out? I say yes, absolutely. And
100%.
I think this would have been a great start to her nominations, and I think we can agree we would kick out Dorothy McGuire.
Yep.
And final question, Miles McHale. Should Maureen O'Hara have been nominated for Miracle on 34th Street?
I am like a Maureen O'Hara junkie, so I say yes.
Yeah. Again, I would take it over Dorothy, so I'd happily have her nominated. I don't think
Or
she ever got a
Roz.
nomination,
No, she never did.
so that would have been nice. But we come to our final segment here where we make our verdict as to who we think was the runner-up. Nathaniel, do we think that Roz was indeed the runner-up?
I do think that, yeah, but not enthusiastically for any of the votes.
Yeah, I don't think any of the others really had enough of a narrative to get to that upper echelon here. I think Joan was just in her afterglow period. Susan Hayward, I think, was like, welcome to the club. Maybe we're not going to get you quite yet, but strong start. And with Dorothy McGuire, like, I don't see the passion for that. So, yeah, sadly, Roz, this would have been your time. But last question I have for you, Nathaniel, who would be your winner if you had a ballot? Who would you have picked?
I'm kind of torn between Hayward and Crawford, but I would probably go for Crawford just because I think she's good from the beginning, and Hayward, needs the role to get crazy before her brilliance comes out.
Yeah. I agree with you, actually. It's between those two for me, but I would have gone with Joan Crawford. I also had given her an award for Mildred Pierce. So in my own personal world, Joan Crawford is now a 2-time Oscar winner. And within very short time frame too. I think she is complete in control of that character from the beginning. And I think she's just really great in those specific kinds of darker psychological roles. So love that. Looking forward to her last nomination in the 50s, even though I feel like I want to be talking about her more. But like you were saying earlier, she really had 3 excellent nominations. So with that, thank you again, Nathaniel, for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Fun, and I'm super jealous of whoever gets to discuss Sudden Fear.
Yes, that's going to be amazing. So, well, tell the people where they could find more of you on the internet.
I'm on Twitter at Nathaniel R, and also my website is thefilmexperience.net.
Yes, highly recommend. And thank you all so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson, and the podcast is at Oscar Runner-Up on Twitter, Instagram at And the Runner-Up Is. Rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you liked what you heard and want to hear more, go to patreon.com/andtherunnerupis, where you can hear a whole bunch of bonus episodes. And next week, we'll be talking about the 1948 Best Actress race. The nominees were Ingrid Bergman for Joan of Arc, Olivia de Havilland for The Snake Pit, Irene Dunn for I Remember Mama, Barbara Stanwyck for Sorry Wrong Number, and Jane Wyman for Johnny Belinda, with the winner being Jane Wyman. I'm already in mourning that those are the last opportunities I'll have to talk about Irene Dunn and Barbara Stanwyck. But that's what to watch before next week. Thanks so much again, Nathaniel.
Oh, it was great. I loved it. Thank you for having me back.
Of course. And with that, I will bid you all adieu.